The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here as always with my co-host, John Cuna. Today we have an exciting interview. We're interviewing Nathan Baugh. Nathan started a company, a sports media company called Sideline Sprint. He's also one of my favorite followers on Twitter. In case anyone wants to check him out, I believe it's at Nathan Baugh. At Nathan Baugh 27 on Twitter. Nathan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
So, Nathan, on Twitter, it says you cover the intersection of sports and psychology, and I just wanted to start by getting a little bit more information about why and sort of what that means to you.
Great question. So, for me, one of the biggest things with sports is I look at like the top performing athletes and what they do differently. And a lot of it strikes me as very similar to what either top performing professionals, CEOs, investors, whatever the case may be, it's very similar. So digging into kind of how that like echelon of people thinks, how they operate, is fascinating, and it's something that I just really enjoy writing about.
That's awesome. What are the things? So when it comes to, I know one of your favorite threads. I mean, on Twitter, you're someone I consider sort of a master of the Twitter thread, which is something with, not to brag about my 41 followers, Johnny, but I have not mastered the Twitter thread yet. It's something I aspire to doing at some point. One of the threads you had was on sort of uncovering, maybe taking a deep dive, and I know you put a ton of time into uncovering out of the 0.002% or 0.2% of athletes that do end up playing pro, what are they doing that kind of maybe leads to that or correlates with them becoming a professional? So that was one thread that I found really fantastic. How do you decide, what are the topics to dig deep and dive deep into before you actually make one of those threads?
Good question. For anybody out there who doesn't know what a Twitter thread is, quick background. Essentially, it's just a series of tweets put together. It's more of like a blog style format. They're really popular right now. If you're not on Twitter, definitely check them out. Good place to learn from different people. But I guess the idea for that one came specifically from, I was watching the Monday Night Football game, and then afterwards, an interview that Derek Carr did that I thought was really poignant was he spent the entire 2 minutes with, millions of people watching him, just completely praising a teammate's effort, a teammate who doesn't usually kind of get that limelight, and he gave it all to him, a teammate that had really stepped up that game. And I think that for his teammates there, that makes them really ready to run through a wall for Carr. They're very appreciative of that, but then at the same time, it shows everybody else on his team, okay, he called out Zay Jones this game. What can I do next game to be there? And he gave specific examples of what Jones did, shows up 6 a.m. for practice. He's always there. So his other teammates are going to want to do that down the line, just so they can be seen in that same point of view. And that gave me the idea for the thread, and then I just kind of dug into it and ran with it.
That's awesome. No, one might say Carr is the anti-Kyrie Irving with that sort of positive calling out of a teammate as opposed to maybe throwing them under the bus. So I'm always fascinated. So Nathan, I know you started the Sideline Sprint. People listening can go find this at sidelinesprint.com. It's a sports newsletter that they can subscribe to and have it sent by email. It's instantly become one of my favorite reads. Contrary to most things that come across our inbox, I actually enjoy seeing it. It kind of like it lightens me up a little bit. I see it and I'm like, all right, this is a guaranteed 10 minutes to consume some stuff that I find interesting, as opposed to most email these days, which is the opposite. So I always find it really fascinating because a lot of stuff these days seems to be, video driven and or podcast driven or both. What made you decide to, either focus on a email newsletter or start with an email newsletter as part of your sports media company?
Really good question. A couple things. So I see media kind of lives on two different spectrums,
Mm-hmm.
specifically within sports. I would say 0 to 1, 0 being all free, advertising driven media, 1 being all paid. And in sports right now, you're seeing a big shift to paid. You got ESPN Plus, that's their main product. ESPN is becoming more of a streaming service than like a sports news company. You have SI Plus, you have The Athletic, huge success there. So generally, kind of broad sense, a lot of things are moving to paid. So that's why we went with free. So you sign up for free, you'll get every day for free. We'll never charge you for anything. And then the other spectrum would be kind of another 0 to 1. Okay, 0 being all information all the time. So let's say 0 is The Athletic. They put out incredibly high value content.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take you a while to read. You're going to pay for it. And they pay really high quality journalists to write that. I think it's a pretty niche company that's grown really quickly, showing that there's kind of a market for that section, but it's for like big sports fans. Like if you're a casual fan, you're not paying for The Athletic. Mm-hmm. And then you have kind of the 10, which is entertainment, all entertainment based. Think Barstool.
Yep.
Again, massive success. What they put out, you're probably not going to learn a lot from it, but it's going to make you laugh. It's going to make you smile. It's going to be a little controversial, but it's going to draw a ton of eyeballs to it. So you kind of have those two spectrums. So what I thought was, okay, in sports media, let's try and do a contrary. Let's be a 0. Let's be advertising based. So it's free for folks to actually read. And then when it comes to the spectrum of informative to entertainment, let's be a 5. Kind of split the difference there. When you think about sports, there's not really much that's, witty, but also insightful. Mm-hmm. It's kind of one or the other. So we want to be both. And we think that kind of the younger generation is really drawn to that style of writing and content. We want to start with the newsletter specifically because it's such a great way to just build a relationship with an audience. Mm-hmm. There's not many places where you just send an email and people can reply. We get replies every single day, especially if we mess something up. They'll be like, oh, this was actually this stat or whatever. But that's pretty cool that you get to build a relationship with readers. We can ask them questions and results. We do trivia every day. Just kind of make it fun like that. I thought newsletter was the best place to start.
That's awesome. I think, one thing I want to find out more about is what led you to start the Sideline Sprint. I think John and I started Riser and Tread in 2019. And, we know even before getting to the point where we both partnered up to start that, there was a whole stretch of years where we were doing things that kind of fed into what Riser and Tread ended up becoming. And it's never as easy, as it might look from the outside. And so I'm always fascinated by, what someone who founds a sports media company, and you talk about bootstrapping that, which to me just all I think is how much hustle and time and energy and focus and dedication goes into making something what it is and what it's going to become. I'm always fascinated by what led them to get to that point and, what they were overlapping or still are overlapping in terms of the timeline of a company, because sometimes you have to do things as a side hustle first before it becomes kind of your main thing. And when to make the choice to switch to it being the main thing is always very delicate. So I'll let you kind of roll with this. So what was the kind of origin of Sideline Sprint, and what was the timeline in terms of, have you overlapped another career or other things, or is this the main thing now, or where does that stand?
I graduated from Clemson University kind of right before COVID. Mm-hmm. So I went into consulting, one of the big consulting firms afterwards. And essentially you're working 70, 80 hours a week. It's just a complete grind. And I loved keeping up with sports before, and it just didn't have time for it. So just completely fall off the board. So I was looking for something like Morning Brew or The Skim or something where it's like quick 4 to 5 minutes in my inbox where I could be up to date on sports. And I didn't really find anything that stuck with me. I tried a couple of different things, but just they weren't quite right for what I wanted. So I was like, you know what? This is an opportunity here. I've always been somebody that wants to build things. I was very much feeling that, urge to do so. As a consultant, we don't really get to do that. A lot of PowerPoint decks. So I decided to go for it, and been doing it for about 6-7 months now. started to get some traction through Twitter. I can write very punchy little pithy things to get eyeballs on it, and then kind of follow through with like really good content behind that. And that plays really well on Twitter. It's probably the best place to grow a newsletter right now. We've had some success with cross promotions and other similar size newsletters with people that put out really good content as well. So those are two main growth avenues, and we're taking it from there.
That's awesome. So how would you describe the long-term vision of Sideline Sprint, in terms of what you hope it evolves into as you continue to go down this path?
Yeah, it's going to center around the main newsletter for now. We have close to 6,500 subscribers on there. So wow, that's great. We're shooting for 10,000 by the end of the year as a goal.
Nice.
We'll start to monetize it at some point here in Q4. We haven't yet because full-time jobs, you can only really do a couple different things. You can grow it. You can write the content. Those two absolutely have to get done. You have to do them well to keep people around. And the third thing is selling, monetizing, making ads. So we recently partnered with somebody who's going to basically outsource the ad side of it. So that's great. So we should be able to have a little bit of money to actually grow it through paid soon, which will be wonderful. We have considered taking on capital, but we're not sure if we're going to at some point or not. We know folks in the industry who have had a lot of success doing that. We've talked to them. They've kind of encouraged it, but we'll see if it's right for us. And then down the line, once we get to say 100,000 subs, give or take, you can kind of start thinking about other verticals for newsletters. And sports, I think you have sports betting, sports business, you have women's sports, you have esports, and those are kind of the four different verticals that I would think to do outside of kind of the general sports newsletter. Mm-hmm. I don't think those would be every day, probably twice a week, and go from there, keep it within newsletters for a while. But then you're starting to see newsletter companies branch out into podcasts, into TikTok, Instagram, wherever they want to go. They're really able to drive that audience through the newsletter. So,
yeah. Do you want to do a podcast at some point? That some of your threads seemed. We actually made a podcast episode out of the thread that was about the 0.02% of athletes that go pro and what you kind of found. That thread was such a great conversation for us to turn into a podcast because each player, the light you shed on each player in that thread was very unique in terms of what it means to be a professional athlete and what leads to success and a lot of interesting things. So it seems tailor-made for a podcast. Is that something you guys want to do someday?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right now it's all about focus because it's hard to excel at a bunch of different mediums, but down the line, definitely do a podcast.
Nice.
Yeah, there's always a lot of things going on. That's something that Jotham and I definitely continue to try to manage and stay focused on, having all of these different things and avenues and places that we want to do. I think old school ways of trying to access people are rapidly changing, and I think trying to find different and creative ways to access people and to get information to them is always sort of an ongoing thing. And it's always nice talking to another person who has an idea and has the courage to kind of go out there and sort of, this is something that we need to make a change, and actually takes the steps to go out there and do that. So, and that's been great being able to learn more about it. I kind of want to switch gears a little bit. One of the things that Jotham and I talk a lot of, and we're pretty big Boston fans, and so we talk about the difference of being like both a therapist and being a fan. Sometimes those don't really go together.
I think you manage those roles better than I do. I think when my fan hat's on, I kind of let loose a little bit too much sometimes.
It's
ingrained in me. Yeah.
It depends. If it's the Bruins playing, I get pretty irrational.
Okay. Yeah. Or your soccer fandom.
Or a soccer fandom. Yeah.
Nathan, just don't bring up Lionel Messi around him, or else you're just going to get it volleyball spiked back in your face.
Yeah. No, we all know Ronaldo's better, so we don't have to go down that road. But I'm really kind of curious to hear your thoughts on fandom as a whole and being a fan, what it means, how does it intersect with like social media and places like that. I'm really kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are of that, because it's a fascinating topic that I don't hear too many other people talking about it, but it's definitely something that's there. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts around it.
That's a great question. First of all, congrats to your Red Sox, looking really good.
Knock on wood.
Let's go.
We're superstitious around
Easy.
here, Nathan.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah. Knock on wood right now. I don't know how many more grand slams you guys got coming.
Oh,
I know.
It's wild.
So congrats on that. But on the fandom question, it's a great question. I think so when you look at, I'm a very data-driven person. So looking at just sheer social media following numbers, I think is a good place to see kind of where fandom is going.
Mm-hmm.
It's all player-driven. Cristiano Ronaldo, most followed person on Instagram. He's got like 300 million people on there.
Mm-hmm.
That's insane. So it just speaks to people are starting to follow players more than they follow teams. There are exceptions. I think Boston people are likely exceptions. You guys have fantastic sports town. But the vast majority of the US kind of as a country doesn't necessarily have like a fantastic sports team. It's very rare that you have the Red Sox, the Bruins, the Patriots, all in the same city.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can talk about New York or LA or Chicago or some of these other massive cities having the same thing. But for folks who aren't from those places, it's really following these players. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, probably the city with the most Steph Curry fans, simply because he's from Charlotte.
Yep.
Grew up in Davidson. So it's all going player driven. I think that's going to continue to be a trend. I think that's why leagues like the NBA are doing so well. They do a great job of highlighting their players on social media through the broadcast, things like that. I think it's really powerful for them. Then you look at startup leagues like Premier Lacrosse League. They've done a fantastic job of using media to highlight their players, and they're one of the fastest growing leagues in the world because of how well they've done their media. And a lot of that is player driven. Yeah,
no, that's fantastic. I mean, we're always fascinated by, I think the combination of social media and fandom can be a dangerous combination, just because, you put the fan hat on, and especially guys, I feel like with testosterone tend to let loose a little bit with their emotions and kind of let it fly, not necessarily thinking rationally. And then when you combine that with Twitter, or social media being what we consider an extension of the self, something that almost gives a false buffer to people, that gives them a false sense of security and maybe a platform to be able to say things or do things that they wouldn't normally do because they feel that extension from themselves gives them a false sense of safety behind that. And it can lead to a lot of dangerous things. I mean, I think we've seen that. How have you dealt with, I'm guessing you've had some kind of Twitter trolls, like everybody does. How have you managed to deal with that? It's
a great question. First of all, there's very much it's very easy if you have, a certain number of followers or your profile picture isn't your face. Like, it's very easy to be anonymous and just say whatever you want. I've definitely gotten some of it, not a ton.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, most of it, I just go in and I hit mute and I never see it again, and it doesn't really bother me. So that's just, if you are on social media, just mute the person and you'll never hear from them again. And there's a lot more, I would say, positive people out there than negative people. So that's really, really promising to see. And if somebody does comment and it gets some likes or whatever, you can just go back and look at the original post, like, all right, a lot more people agreed with me than agreed with you. And you just try to move on. And it's okay. And I think for athletes, most of them handle it really, really well. And they probably do something similar, or I'm sure they have some kind of social media manager that goes in and just blocks people who are being jerks for whatever reason. But you do see some trying to get into it. I think KD is the classic example of he has no qualms holding back, and he'll just roast people on Twitter. And that's how he does it. And it works for him. So I think people just figure it out and realize it's not a big deal.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because it's a new one. right? Like we've seen these players using their social media platforms to promote themselves, brands, whatever it happens to be. It's this whole new world, and the trolls sort of come in. And yeah, I think most teams have some sort of social media manager of like, here's how you interact, here's how you don't interact, and some players listen and some players don't. Particularly KD, David Price was another example of someone who didn't really follow that and got kind of sucked down the rabbit hole. And I think there's, when you've got like Cristiano Ronaldo, who has essentially every person in the United States following him, right? Equivalent. Managing that seems like such a difficult thing. And I'm just curious as to if you have thoughts about where you feel like this progression is going, and what pitfalls do you see this for individual athletes specifically having these big platforms to reach millions of people? There's obviously massive benefits for them to be able to use platforms for change, for social justice, for advocacy, for themselves, right? I'm really kind of curious. I'm always curious because we have this really terrible way of finding the middle. We always sort of go from one polar opposite to the next. And I'm just kind of curious where you see potential pitfalls are for athletes with this new wave of social media as their platform.
Yeah. My mind immediately goes to Naomi Osaka, the tennis player. Recently dropped out of a couple major tournaments. I think French Open, Wimbledon, a lot due to mental health, wanting to take a step back from tennis. Her thing was more with the media actually at the tournaments and the questions that they would ask and kind of the pressure put on those athletes there. I do think we see similar things across social media. You see, she's probably the best example right now of just an athlete that's needed to take a step back and has gone ahead and done that for herself. But I would not be surprised at all to see that trend a little bit more, where athletes do take, a couple months and they just kind of disappear for a while to get away from all of it.
Yeah, it feels like we're heading towards like a recalibration, right? Like it does. You see Naomi was one, obviously Simone Biles for additional reasons as well, but you're seeing more and more athletes kind of coming out and kind of pushing back. I think it sort of, it comes with pros and cons, right? Having access to people, but then people having access to you, right? And you can mute it, you can try to wave it out, but when you've got millions of people following you, of course you're going to hear the noise. And 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, athletes would show up, they'd perform, they'd maybe have a little bit of media battle in the press conferences, and then they'd go home. Right now, you've just got 24/7 potentially like abuse from random people, like Jotham was saying, who just feel empowered because they don't have to stand in front of you and say what they want to say. And it does seem like we're kind of heading towards there. Jotham and I have talked a lot about this in some earlier previous podcast about this, but I'm curious, like, do you see a middle ground here? Do you see avenues or places that you think would be great, whether it's through, social media avenues or platforms like things like you're trying to do, or sports pieces that way? Like, where do you see the middle being in this?
Have you guys heard of Overtime? It's another sports media startup.
That sounds familiar.
So
I haven't, no.
Quick background. Overtime started a couple, 4 years ago. They're backed by a ton of people. KD is one of the backers. Venture raised worth like $800 million. They're doing a really great job. I listened to actually their founder, Dan Porter. He has a very interesting perspective that I would expect to be seen more and more in media. And specifically what they do, they're huge on TikTok, huge on Instagram. They recently just started their own basketball league, actually, for high schoolers. Anybody listening, check it out, Overtime Elite. They have Kevin Ollie, the former UConn basketball coach, as leading all the basketball operations there. Really interesting stuff. But back to kind of the mental health topic, what he said is when they were originally starting out, they were going to put out zero content that was negative towards any athlete. And they've stuck to that. And it's led them to, that's just one pillar of their content strategy. It's always positive. And it's always focused on the person, making the move or doing the dunk or whatever, not the person who had to step back for whatever reason, who got dunked on, who just looked like a fool for some reason. It's always positive. They now have Overtime on TikTok has more followers than the NBA, more followers in the NFL or the Premier League. And a lot of it, I think, is due to people know that it's going to be positive content. And positive content keeps people coming back to it instead of just being like a clickbait negative article that, Bleacher may put it out or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really positive trend, and to see them be successful with that strategy is awesome. It's something that at Sideline Sprint we're trying to do. You hopefully notice most of it is very positive towards athletes and all that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great way for media to go about it. Specifically on social media, I don't think there's any way to necessarily avoid the trolls, but hopefully, kind of mass market media starts moving towards that more positive side of things.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think one of the things we're seeing more and more as like social media is like it's not going anywhere, obviously, of people like really pushing back a little bit right now. I mean, all the things that kind of came out from Facebook about a month ago was something we already sort of knew, but then we know, and people now pushing back and talking a lot, even influencers talking a lot about really trying to put out more positive content and really focusing on who you follow, and are the follows something that are making you feel a little bit better or empowered or thought-provoking, and not thinking about these in these negative ways. And so that's a really great recommendation for anyone listening to add that to their follow, for good content and some positivity. We get bombarded with the opposite all the time. It's nice to know that there are companies out there, yours included, that are trying to reshift that paradigm a little bit. So that's great.
Very true, especially because, we've talked a lot in past episodes about how, the human brain is really conditioned towards negativity. And when that sort of combines with a collective kind of movement on social media, I think there's a compounding effect that happens where, the media takes on all the individuals' slants towards negativity, and it combines into this tornado of negativity that just bombards people, and their brains are going to latch on to the negative stuff a lot stronger than they are the positive stuff. So we need as many positive sources as we can out there to try to counteract that tidal wave. So I think it's great that what you're doing, and we definitely encourage everyone to check out Overtime Elite. I'm going to check that out. I've always been a Kevin Ollie fan. I kind of followed him from the UConn days. So that's fantastic. I don't envy one of the things, John, and Nathan, in our past episodes, we've talked a lot about how difficult it must be for pro athletes. I think a lot of times we see, whether it's fans just having the fan hat on or people just not understanding their experience, they often kind of give the whole, yeah, but they're rich, so it should be fine, or that kind of thing, where they don't really take time to maybe show a little empathy and hop in their shoes and try to understand, like, what would this be like? I would never want to be a professional athlete based on what they have to deal with, if only just looking at social media and what it's like to have to be on there and try to be a brand, and that's like sort of what you have to do these days, and yet it must cause challenges about how to stay humble. One example that comes to mind is part of that thread we mentioned earlier that you put on Twitter about starting with Derek Carr, and I think the second athlete was Alex Caruso. And we've talked about that a lot because I think, when people are really great athletes and they're told they have to be a brand, and they're told from a very young age that they're the best thing ever, it has to impact them psychologically, and it has to impact their sense of self to a level where it must be hard to actually maintain an accurate and unbiased perspective of what's needed to get to the next level. And it makes me think of the G League with Alex Caruso saying, hey, what I see is these people come in and, they need to know their role in order to make it from G League to pros, but they think they're supposed to prove that they're the star. And I think that's one thing that sticks out to me, that it must be really hard for these talented athletes to stay humble and stay hungry and grounded in a way that's going to actually get them to the next level, sort of like Alex Caruso showed.
Yeah, no, his story is fantastic. He was with the Oklahoma City Thunder at the time when he was talking about all this. And his whole thing was the Thunder at the time had Russell Westbrook and they had Victor Oladipo, two of the best guards in the NBA. So Caruso was like, as a point guard, they don't need me to go score 25 points a game. They're paying Russell Westbrook $30 million a year to do that. Like, it doesn't matter if I score 25 in the G League. So he talked to Sam Presti, their GM, and he's like, all right, what'll make me stand out? And Presti was like, it's your decision-making and it's your defense. So that's what Caruso focused on. He became one of the best passers in the NBA, sets up all the plays, runs them correctly. And then his defense, he went from, in his words, an average defender to a guy that could go head to head with Westbrook and maybe hold him to 25 a game instead of 35. And that made him, stand out. And he's become very, very successful in the NBA. I think there's just a lot to learn there, both in athletics and then in all aspects of life.
Yeah, absolutely. John and I own Rise and Tread together, and I think we're always big proponents of, staying humble and saying, what do we have to do that's in the best interest of the team and the best interest of the company? And that could be anything, right? Whether it's doing a podcast episode, whether it's emptying the trash in an office or vacuuming, like we will do whatever it takes. It doesn't matter, and we have to switch gears. And I think staying humble is really, really key, and never getting too high on yourself, no matter what you're achieving. And that I thought that was such a great thread because it really touched on that. And I think some people struggle to stay grounded, and it costs them big time. So we just to bring it back to Twitter a little bit, because you have so many great threads, and I notice you you always promote some other people that have amazing content on Twitter. Some of them are athletes, some of them are business people, some of them are sort of academics or intellectuals. A lot of fascinating people. I've picked up on several key follows just from seeing who you kind of retweet or who you like. Are there specific people on Twitter, Nathan, for you, like either players or non-athletes, that you would recommend people check out?
So in sports, I would say Ndamukong Suh is fantastic follow on Twitter. He talks about whether it's playing for the Buccaneers or his investing side of things. That's one other thing I'm very interested in, is like athletes becoming more and more of investors. He's invested in, I think, 3 unicorn companies now. So 3 startups worth over $1 billion. Very impressive guy. Definitely some benefits of going to Nebraska. He counts Warren Buffett as a mentor. They get coffee kind of once a quarter, it sounds like. So
nice.
Give Ndamukong Suh a follow. I enjoyed following him. Joe Pompliano, great Twitter content. He's been an early supporter of Sideline Sprint, so very much appreciate Joe and what he's doing with Huddle Up. It's fantastic. So those are the 2 I'd recommend in sports. Outside of sports, Sahil Bloom, great for really any kind of learning. He just digs into what he's curious about. Gotten to work with Sahil some, gotten to know him. Fantastic guy. He's the real deal. Blake Burge, somebody I met very early on Twitter, another really good guy. He's really interesting. He's very big into like stoicism and philosophy. So all of his threads are going to be around that. So anybody interested in like just mental models and where to get better, where to improve yourself, Blake's a good follow. Those are the 4 I would recommend the most.
Fantastic. We appreciate that. One other question I wanted to ask you about. So John and I, obviously, we have this podcast where we take a look at mental health through the lens of sports. And it's been interesting. We try to shine a light on the athletes who have been vocal about their mental health journey in a way to kind of not only shine light on that to reduce stigma, but also to give almost to open a window to educate people. We feel like, especially young guys, but not just young guys, want to learn about mental health and would benefit from learning about mental health, but the way in which they learn can sometimes be important. I think through the lens of sports is a much more approachable, less daunting kind of way to learn about mental health. So we're definitely passionate about that. And we've tried to, touch on athletes that, again, share their own stories or, have interesting things going on that relate to mental health in a way that we can educate people about it. Kyrie Irving is someone who is a bit of an enigma, and we're still trying to figure out where he stands. Some days it seems like he's kind of a hero. Some days it seems like he's kind of a villain. What are your thoughts? Someone who, obviously is a huge sports fan, has a sports media company, following the ups and downs of Kyrie Irving. What are your thoughts on him in general in terms of how it relates to, mental health?
I think Kyrie, he's a first very complicated individual, obviously. But I think that speaks to kind of a lot of us. We tend to look at these athletes and categorize them as like, seems like a great guy or a terrible guy or girl, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you can't really do that with anybody. And I think Kyrie really speaks to that. I mean, the dude, when what happened with George Floyd last summer, he went and bought his mom a house. He's donated millions of dollars to a lot of different charities and around Brooklyn and around Cleveland. Has fed tons of people through the holidays and tons of gifts. But then at the same time, you look, and I think last year he took off a couple weeks for his mental health, right around Christmas time, I believe. So there's clearly something going on there. I don't think we know what it is. He's a very private guy. I'm talking about the whole COVID vaccine and all that good stuff. Like he put out one video and otherwise hasn't really addressed it to the media at all. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he's spoken with his teammates and things like that, but it's really hard to categorize him. I don't know what goes on in his head. I doubt really anybody does outside of his very inner circle. He seems pretty private.
It's such a, yeah, it is. And I think it shines light on one of the things that Jotham and I talk about. You know, when we bring up athletes and we talk about their experiences, we really try to make sure that we're not speculating, right? We have no idea about these people. We have backgrounds, obviously, and trained, we're trained in sort of mental health and those types of things, but we're not diagnosing or working of like, well, these people, we don't know these people. We're really basing our information off of what they have shared with us. And Kyrie, being a really private person, makes it difficult. You just have his actions to sort of look at. And it's complicated. And one of the things you brought up that I think is really an important topic is like the concept of labeling. I think, especially in sports media, right? It's like, okay, we got to figure out who this player is so that we can put him in a box, right? And keep him there. And then if he tries to stray from it, that's a story, right? Like everything's about creating a label for this person and putting it there so that I can make a narrative about this person, whether it's based in fact or not. And I can only imagine how unbelievably difficult that must be for any athlete. I think one person that comes to mind too, who I have my ups and downs with as well. But LeBron James is a perfect example of, he was the golden child since he was like born, right? He's been being fed, you're the best, you're the best, you're the best. And I won't go there yet. Nathan, I'm not going to tell you he's the best yet. I'm not quite there yet, but you can easily argue that he is, right? But I think, for a long time, everybody hated him for no apparent reason other than the fact that he was just like great. And
the decision didn't help.
The decision was really misstep, right, and I think his only real misstep was that decision. Taking it to Miami was a tough one, right? And even him making a decision to go there isn't the problem, but the production of it and all these different things. And then for a while, there were even commercials about him, like I've embraced the villain. And I'm so curious if that's just him being like, I'm tired of hearing this from every single avenue, and so fine, I'm just going to accept it. And I'm curious if that's like an experience that most athletes or a lot of athletes go through of, the public opinion or the public narrative becomes the internal one. And I just see that as being such a difficult thing for athletes to try to manage. I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I put out a thread recently on sports books that kind of recommend. The very first one there is Open by Andre Agassi. Not sure if you guys have read it. It's an autobiography. Fantastic book. And it goes into how he, growing up, he became kind of this golden child of tennis. He was this guy, long hair, very charismatic, incredibly talented, won Grand Slams, at the age of 20, became kind of the face of the sport at such a young age. And I think what he talks about in that book, it really speaks to the question you're asking of these highs and lows and what you think of yourself from the public perspective. And even there, he talks about, at some point he would be on top of the world, think he was, exactly what the public said, this, incredible athlete, superstar. And then other times he would be the lowest of lows where, couldn't really get out of bed. He really struggled to do kind of basic tasks. And I think it would be very hard as an athlete to see all these things talked about you and not be extremes over and over again, which I think would be pretty exhausting. So it kind of comes back to what we're talking about of if you're able to try to center yourself and stay humble, but that would be incredibly hard to do with all this noise around you.
Right. And then even trying to say something or to come up, you're just going to get into this power struggle back and forth, and it's really not going to do much of anything other than probably just feed into the negative narrative of yourself, right? And it's a really fascinating conversation. And I do at Riser and Tread, one of my focuses is I do a lot of work with athletes, both all from professional level all the way down to the junior leagues, right, or the little kids. So and one of the biggest things that I see with athletes across the board, from when they're starting to play the sport all the way up till they're to the professional level, is this like separation of self and performance, right? If they're only as good as they can perform, right? And for someone who's not having millions and millions of followers, who maybe are constantly telling them that was a terrible performance or that was a great performance, I can only imagine that that's just a magnifying glass on that concept for athletes, specifically in the professional world, where probably, again, speculating, but knowing that just based on the work that I've done and the experience of seeing that in majority of the athletes I work with, that this concept of like, I had a bad performance, so my mood is going to be heavily shifted for days sometimes afterwards. And if then I'm getting 10 million messages from people telling me that I suck and I'm terrible and that was the worst performance they've ever seen, I imagine that you talked about Andre in that hole, or couldn't get out of bed, or whatever it was, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's just such a fascinating concept. Just kind of curious to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think it's different in individual sports and team sports as well. I would go ahead and say individual sports would be a lot tougher when it came to a bad performance. Andre, obviously with tennis, or you talk about boxing, different sports like that, a lot of the Olympic sports. But when you look at team sports, I think a lot of it will come down to the coach and how kind of the captains on the team and all that stuff react to the loss. So I would just think individual sports to be incredibly hard. It's a lot more kind of internally driven, I think, to pull yourself out of that and be able to pick it up and move on. And the best, players in the world are the ones able to do that. You look at Roger Federer, he could play the best point of his life or completely mishit a tennis ball. And the next point, you would have no idea which one it was, because he's just the same all the time.
Yeah, having a short memory is really key for high-performing athletes and people, who are performing in any kind of difficult landscape, whether it's sports or non-sports. Nathan, this has been fantastic. We really want to thank you for joining us. I want to encourage everyone out there to check him out on Twitter. It's at Nathan Baugh 27. That's at Nathan Baugh 27. And as well to check out his sports media company, the Sideline Sprint, which is at sidelinesprint.com. And you can subscribe to get that newsletter. I definitely recommend it. Again, it's a bright spot in my inbox, which these days we don't have too many of. Nathan, I have an idea for a Twitter thread that I'm going to put together in the next week or two. I might tag you in that just to get some feedback, because I'm a rookie in this area. And we'll see how it goes, and you can let me know what works and what doesn't. Sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. Do it.
Fantastic. So thanks again, Nathan, for joining us. And we want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast for our interview with Nathan Baugh. We'll be back next week.
Thanks, Nathan.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.